Good morning, class. I hope you're all doing well. Um, your professor invited me to speak to you all today about my book because I'm aware that the research that you have been looking at this semester is pertinent to my research interests. So I was more than happy to come and speak to you about my book this morning. Well, this afternoon, I guess it's the afternoon on your side. I quickly want to introduce myself before I get into it. Um, my name is Dr. Ato Kwamena Onoma. I am from Sierra Leone. I hold a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Ghana. I moved to the States shortly after completing my undergraduate studies, where I enrolled in Northwestern University for my PhD. I have a PhD in political science. After my PhD, I became an assistant professor of political science at Yale. Um, Currently, I reside in Ethiopia in East Africa, where I'm the research director for the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. I am also the author of the book Anti-Refugee Violence in African Politics, which is the book that I'm going to be reviewing today. I think it's important to kind of talk about what prompted me to write about anti-refugee violence in African politics and why I was just very interested in this topic before I kind of get into discussing the book. The broad questions concerning refugee-host relations that I explored in this book began to occupy my mind in 1967. I think it's important to add that I was a refugee myself. I fled Sierra Leone with my family due to the war, and I remember living in Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Accra throughout my childhood. It was only in Accra I was able to enroll in the University of Ghana, and I was able to leave Africa after then. So I had just begun my semester at Northwestern University when I received news about the widespread attacks on refugees in Conakry, the capital of Guinea, and this was in early September of 2000. I started receiving phone calls from my family and friends who were living in Guinea at the time, who explained to me what was happening. Children were being murdered, women were being raped, people were fleeing. There was a lot of instability at the time. I was a graduate student then, and I was exploring topics for my dissertation, and I figured that this might be an excellent opportunity to kind of explore this topic further. As I, decided to, you know, as I started compiling information about this, I think it was all a little bit too fresh, and it became a very traumatic experience as it hit so close to home that I decided to stop writing my dissertation on this topic, and I ended up writing my dissertation on politics of land rights in Africa. So it was only when I arrived in Yale in 2007 where I decided to revisit the topic, revisit the subject of refugee-host relations. I had so many colleagues at Yale at the time who were very interested in violence and conflict of refugees within the African context, who really did encourage me to write about this book. At the time, I had access to great resources. I felt that I was in a better position to really commit my time to researching and really conducting an in-depth analysis into anti-refugee violence and the connection of violence and African politics. So my key research question was, why do local populations mobilize to commit large-scale violent attacks against refugees, whereas others refrain from doing so? So in my book, Anti-Refugee Violence in African Politics, I argue that attacks by locals on refugees occur in situations of political instability and can only happen when states permit and encourage them. Even in relatively weak states, they do have the capacity to prevent systematic attacks on refugees by local populations. But states encourage and organize such attacks when some refugees get involved in local opposition groups that pose serious challenge to state leaders. Anti-refugee violence allows the state to punish refugee activists and dissuade further opposition activism. So in a way, attacks on refugees by host states thus have to be partly understood as the use of refugees as pawns by local actors in the domestic struggle for political dominance. My research compared instances of violence and nonviolence against refugees drawing from multiple events, some in the same country. So I used comparative studies from Western Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa. My case studies included Guinea, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Uganda. I dedicated chapter 3 and 4 to the situation in Guinea, which happened in September of 2000, when the former Guinea president Lassana Conte publicly called on Guineans to expel refugees from Sierra Leone and Liberia. The government accused them of aiding rebel incursions. The Guinean capital of Conakry saw a week-long of attacks on refugees, including the systematic rape of refugee women. But Guineans in the forest region resisted the call to expel refugees. There was little to no violence on refugees, and in some ways protected refugees from the violence. Chapters 5 and 6 of my book explored Eastern Africa. In the Great Lakes region, the refugees that fled the 1959 Rwandese social revolution had similarly varied experiences. When the late President Mobutu ordered the expulsion from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in 1967, local populations in eastern Congo joined the state's agents in attacking the refugees. However, in 1982, the government of the late President Milton Obote of Uganda also called for the expulsion of refugees from the southwestern side of Uganda. But unlike Congo, locals refrained from attacking refugees and sometimes tried to protect them from these violent attacks. So my book really explores why does this happen? Why, in some instances, are local communities kind of like more than ready to attack refugees, while in other instances, host communities protect refugees. I argue that locals join state attacks on refugees when refugees settle in areas where one's residence in an area is more relevant than one's origin, determining rights to land and power. So in these areas, which many would categorize as more open to strangers, refugees can settle in autonomous of local elites. So this ensures that influential locals come to know very little about the lives of refugees. So when state officials incite violence against refugees, maybe accusing them of plotting against host communities, because locals and refugees live in like very different areas, locals know very little knowledge about refugees. They don't really have much of a relationship. So they either buy into these narratives or attack refugees out of uncertainty. However, in areas where one's origin is given more weight than one's residence in determining rights to land and power, refugees are allowed to settle only based on their subjugation to local notables. This subjugation gives locals a deep understanding of refugees' lives. Locals refuse to buy into the deep demonization of refugees by state leaders. They resist being roped into attacks on refugees, and hinder opportunities from joining in on such attacks. In these situations, locals opt instead for counterinsurgency measures that do not target refugees at all, so only leads back to the relationships locals have with refugees and maybe the political influence that political actors have in that area. In the concluding chapter of my book, I explored policies that can be implemented to protect refugees. A policy suggestion that I really stressed is a need to put in place protective measures such as safe houses and evacuation plans in societies that are prone to anti-refugee violence. So that kind of includes my review of my book. It's now time to kind of speak about the strengths and my weaknesses and shortcomings. I believe I achieved my goal. I provided a compelling and counterintuitive argument for explaining what conditions local populations engage in large-scale attacks against refugees. And I think readers really appreciated how I combined historical analysis of a wide range of regional cases to shed light on the causal mechanisms underlying generalized anti-refugee violence. I think the greatest strength, after speaking to my colleagues and many readers, was including powerful testimonies from those who experienced and were spared anti-refugee violence attacks in countries that I studied. readers also appreciate my own personal accounts of my experience being a refugee in Ghana as well as Guinea as well. I think it's always important to kind of like include, you know, it's always important when you've had a first, when you've experienced being a refugee yourself. In retrospect, I do believe that there were some shortcomings. There were some things that I would definitely change if I was given the opportunity to write the book again today. One of the greatest strengths of this book turned out to be one of its shortcomings. While the book was lauded for its thematic focus on refugees in Africa, it did not explore how these arguments can be extended beyond the realm of African politics to explain host refugee conflicts in other regions around the world. So, in retrospect, I do believe that the book could have benefited from a more robust attempt to generalize its core arguments and its theories. Another critique that I received that I do agree on concerns the policy section of the book. Given the wealth of literature on refugees from a policy perspective, the concluding chapter of the book would have benefited from a concrete analysis of the measures that can be taken for preventing future refugee violence. Many argued that this chapter was underdeveloped, and after reading the chapter again, I do agree that considering all the information that I had, I could have, paid a little bit more attention to that chapter, and it definitely warranted further analysis and research. Other than that, I think that the book received very, very good reviews. It was one of the books that really focused on anti-refugee violence within the African context at that time. Obviously, now that there's lots more literature on anti-refugee violence and African politics today, but at that time there wasn't. So I do believe that I was able to kind of achieve my goal and kind of explore this research topic in depth. So that kind of concludes my review of the book. Thank you so much for having me again. I know many of you are probably, students of political science or international relation majors. So if you would like to specialize in African politics or political violence, or you're considering, writing your senior thesis on refugee violence, I would definitely recommend reading this book as it contains a lot of useful information, and some of the case studies that I use are super pertinent and apt to your studies. And I can also recommend books that would definitely be beneficial to you as well. So that really concludes my presentation. I would like to thank you, Professor, for having me again. Please do let me know if you have any questions. I'll be more than happy to answer. And I will leave my contact details below. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your class.